Right, I think we're going to start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this CLA webinar on the role of landowners in delivering nature recovery. My name is Judy Cale-Hammond. I am the Director of Policy and Advice at the CLA, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this webinar, which will last about an hour. Today, we'll be hearing from Natural England about their vision for nature recovery and how CLA members can contribute, first with a general overview and then with a presentation on national nature reserves. Sandwiched between the two, we'll have a panel discussion with Natural England and a couple of eminent CLA members. I'll introduce them in a few moments, and with an opportunity for audience participation. Before we hear from our first speaker, I'd like to set the scene from the CLA's perspective and first consider why nature recovery is something which we as a membership organisation care about and want to help our members with. In the last 2 years, I think it's fair to say that the state of nature has risen in importance among policymakers, and now, some would say finally, ranks on a par with climate change. Let me give you a few highlights of this. So firstly, the review of the economics of biodiversity led by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta and published in February 2021 established the extent of the decline, its impact and its cost for us and for future generations. That's a great evidence base, very uncomfortable reading, and a real call for action. Even before that, the Prime Minister, I should say the then Prime Minister, had made a public commitment to protect 30% of the UK's land for nature by 2030. And I think it's fair to say that DEFRA and its agencies are still working on what this looks like in practice. But in any case, that's a very big ambition and one that will have a direct impact on CLA members. There is now a target on the face of the Environment Act 2021 to halt the decline in the abundance of species by 2030, from which in turn will stem further targets, which in turn will have an influence on the objectives of the new agri-environmental schemes and thus on the opportunities available to CLA members. All these milestones are set against a context where natural capital as a management tool and a framework for decision-making is becoming slowly more prevalent. And maybe we'll have the opportunity to touch on that briefly and hear about how this concept is being used or not during our panel discussion. Which brings me to the role of land managers. They are in a unique position to contribute to nature recovery, but this will not happen overnight, not least because natural cycles themselves are rarely instant. And crucially, because to do more or to do things differently, most land managers need advice, they need incentives, and the flexibility to make nature recovery fit within a viable rural business. Now, various government policies are coming on in England, with Wales coming in a little later. Policies such as biodiversity net gain, environmental land management schemes, obviously nature recovery networks, and the local nature recovery strategies. What I'm sure we all want to know, and what this afternoon is related to, is why take an interest in nature recovery in the first place at the level of individual farms and businesses? What does it mean on the ground? What does it take to make it happen? How will it be funded? And how can you combine nature recovery with a thriving business? So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Marion Spain. Now, Marion was appointed Chief Executive of Natural England in May 2022, but she'd been carrying out the role on an interim basis since December 2018. I won't read you the whole slide, but suffice to say that Marion has an excellent background and a really broad set of skills and experience in the context of conservation, but also in the context of non-executive government bodies. So before I hand over to her for a presentation, let me just say a little bit about Zoom and running the audience participation, which I mentioned earlier. So most of you will have somewhere on your screen a toolbar that looks like this with a button marked Q&A. So if you can think of any questions that you would like to ask the panel in the next session, at any point during the discussion and during Marianne's presentation, please hit the Q&A button and put your question in the Q&A bar. So we will be weaving as many questions as possible in the panel discussion. So Marianne, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jude. First of all, they say never start with an apology, but I'm going to have to. I'm having some strange tech problems. I'm having to do this on my phone, which is propped up on my laptop in the office, so forgive me if I'm looking slightly nervous. Hopefully it'll flow smoothly. So as Jude has said, I'm Marianne Spain, the Chief Executive of Natural England. And it's quite sobering when you see your biography go up on screen, isn't it? And you realise how long you've been doing this. So I've worked in conservation over 30 years now. And I think the main change I've seen in the last 5 years, Jude was just referring there to the fact that nature is now become much more mainstream in government policy. And what that is feeling like for me and for Natural England is nature and nature recovery is no longer just about protected species. It's no longer just about nature reserves. It's no longer just about people who are specialists and particularly passionate about nature. We're now at a phase in evolution of nature in this country when nature is something that everybody can do. And it's something we do in towns and cities as well as in the countryside. It's something we do on the coast. So there's a real sense at the moment of a sort of a movement of lots of people coming together, private landowners, businesses, government, NGOs, to really think about how we can all contribute to nature recovery. Perhaps exemplified by the recent announcement from DEFRA of the first 22 landscape recovery pilots. Some of you may be involved in those, but to me, they exemplify what the future looks like because they are bringing together lots of organisations working at scale and all across England. So there is definitely something about everybody needing to pull together to make this happen. And that's one of the reasons why we're delighted that CLA were one of the founding members of the Nature Recovery Network, which is not a thing, it's not a sort of a physical mapped network, or it isn't yet, but it is very much about bringing together people who can bring land, who can bring money, who can bring skills to make nature recovery happen. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Jude has, sorry, I've been told already I mustn't abbreviate Jude Kale's name, apologies. We've already heard that there are the three challenges that government and indeed the whole of society are thinking about. We've got a biodiversity loss challenge, we've got a climate change challenge, we've got declines in public health and well-being. And we're also, of course, seeing the threat to species, the threat to habitats. But I think the other change we are seeing are people in business and in government increasingly seeing that nature is a solution to many of those challenges. So we're all seeing, aren't we, a bigger focus on peat and woodlands and salt marshes and so on as places to store carbon, as well as places for nature. We are seeing an increasingly focus from the water companies, from developers, from bodies like Natural England, on nature being the solution to many of the challenges we're facing on water quality and possibly even water quantity. We're seeing the need to have nature-based solutions to store water, to spread the availability of water through the seasons. We're all familiar, aren't we, with nature being part of the answer to food security. We need pollinators, we need healthy soils if we're going to have food security. And we're also seeing an increasing emphasis on nature as the solution to health and well-being. be that simply people choosing to go for a walk, to clear their heads, to have a bit of a break, to have a bit of a greenery, right through to an increasing focus by the health service on nature being a place for therapeutic and preventative care. So there's lots of reasons why nature matters more and more to government and to people like me. And I'm going to now dare put myself into your shoes and say why it might also increasingly matter to landowners, including what many of you have told me in conversations over the last few years. Of course, it might matter to you for exactly the reasons why it matters to the rest of society. You will care as much as the next man or woman about nature, about climate change, about health and so on. I guess the difference for me when I talk to people in the CLA, I'm hugely envious of your privileged position of actually being the people that can take many of those decisions. You are the people that not just own land, but take decisions about how that land is managed, the tenure on that land, your long-term plans for that land. So if this is something you care about, you've got a fantastic opportunity now to do something about it. I think there's also a growing sense for many landowning and land managing businesses that using nature as the solution will also help you manage business risks. You know, after the summer, well, the summer we're still going through, many people are starting to think now, how can they take more resilience against climate change, more resilience for water storage and so on. Just as an example of the sort of risks that businesses are increasingly facing. It's also mattering more and more because we're seeing many landowners generating an income from nature. And that might be what you might think of the obvious elements of it about through tourism, through visitors. The event that will be happening, the follow-up event, the sister event to today, happening at Elmley Nature Reserve, is an exemplar of a big estate that's making a tourism income from its nature reserve. And there are others, of course, Holcombe being another one that often springs to mind. And we can also see an income generation potential coming forward, not just by government providing incentives for nature-friendly farming. We're also seeing businesses like water companies and like energy companies looking to invest in nature and to buy ecosystem services. I've also had it put to me recently by a CLA member that many of you also think about this from perhaps that slightly old-fashioned concept of philanthropy. You recognise the role you have within communities and the opportunities you can give locally as well to your neighbours and friends in rural areas and elsewhere. And of course, there is a growing possibility that all businesses will have to care about nature more and more if we're starting to move into an era where businesses are going to have to report on their impact on carbon, their impact on nature. That idea of environmental disclosures is likely to affect landowning businesses as well as others. So just a couple of words then on the sort of government side of this. I mentioned the Nature Recovery Network, and as I mentioned, it's not a thing, it's not a map, it's not a giant project, but it is a bringing together of people so that if we are restoring nature as individuals, we're doing that in a better connected way. So the idea being through both the National Nature Recovery Network and the local nature recovery strategies, we can map out where we already have nature and plan to extend and connect it through landowners working collaboratively or even just doing on your own land. You can see how what you're doing is adding to the bigger sum of the whole. And that network will contribute to those government goals that are going to be enshrined in statute if they aren't already. So we've got a statutory target to reverse the decline of species. The new government, actually we're not meant to call them a new government, aren't we? The new cabinet that we will hear about in the next 48 hours or so. One of their first acts will be to, in the environmental sense, one of the first things that the new Environment Secretary will have to decide on is the targets he wants to set in the Environmental Improvement Plan for the state of our protected sites, for the amount of new habitat we need to create as a nation. So there will be these sort of extended targets. And we're also, as Judical has mentioned, we've seen that prime ministerial commitment from our previous Prime Minister that we expect to be embedded again in the international arena for England to continue to lead the world and have that commitment to having our land well protected and well managed. So I'm just going to finish, and this is going to be a bit of a skim through, I'm afraid. I'm not going to be able to do a lot of this justice in the time we have on this call, but hopefully much of it will be familiar to you. And if you don't know where to go to get more information, you will by the end of the call. So I'm going to touch on government money, green finance, and also designations, declarations, and so on. I'm not going to try and explain elms. You will all know at least as much as I do about elms, but you have hopefully, as I say, I mentioned already, seen that government has now announced the first round of landscape recovery pilots. So we are getting that very clear sense of a commitment to public funding for agriculture being linked to nature. And you might also be familiar with the fairly chunky money, even in government terms, the £640 million Nature for Climate Fund, which is funding tree planting and peatland across England. We're also looking at existing and new carbon codes and looking at the role of soils and seagrasses and so on in capturing carbon. You might be aware of some of the projects that Natural England and others are running. So where there are big, we've launched the first 6 of what will be 25 nature recovery projects that are looking to blend public and private finance. So for example, there's one around Cambridge, one on the Somerset wetlands and so on. And we are also increasingly seeing those sort of big joint projects bringing in money from across government, from other departments, including health, from Department of Transport and so on, of linking sort of transport infrastructure to nature recovery. I'm not also going to dwell in detail on the sort of private sector side of green finance, but there is a growing list, some of it mandated by government, some of it coming through other businesses' needs to focus on nature. You'll be aware perhaps that there are big Treasury targets set for DEFRA, as the Environment Department, to grow that investment from the private sector, from private businesses into nature. So we are soon, next year, feels like soon for those that have been working on it for the last several years, biodiversity net gain will come in. And developers will, where they can't offset their nature impacts within the development, will be looking to invest in land either near or far from developments. Perhaps also worth reminding you, this is not just going to apply to housing. It will also apply to major infrastructure, to big transport routes like HS2, will be looking to invest nature in land that's outside their own ownership. You'll perhaps be familiar, because it's been in the headlines quite a bit recently, again, this idea of nutrient neutrality and planners and developers needing to invest in nutrient sinks so that new houses doesn't add to the burden of water quality. You'll probably be very familiar with carbon offsetting, and increasingly we're seeing businesses looking to offset biodiversity impacts. I've spent an hour or so this morning reading through the final drafts, the final responses of what Natural England is going to say for the forthcoming water pricing round, and a growing emphasis from government and Ofwat on water companies investing more and more on nature-based solutions on and off their own land. And I mentioned already the opportunities of working with healthcare providers and social services providers to provide nature spaces to help people maintain and improve their mental and physical health. So I'm going to finish with what my notes have called declarations. I'm carefully not using the word designations. There is always going to be a place for designations, particularly the sort of SSSIs that Natural England has the duty and the power to designate. But perhaps of more interest to landowners like yourselves is my colleague Dagmar will talk in a little bit more detail later about the opportunities to get involved in national nature reserves. And I will just give the plug, it's their 70th birthday this year. Alongside the Queen, they're also having a Platinum Jubilee, so there's lots of events happening. But they are something increasingly that private landowners are getting involved in, perhaps as partners in places like Purbeck, where you've got a blend of government-owned land, wildlife trust, national trust, but also farmers. But as I've mentioned already, there's some fantastic national nature reserves solely owned by landowners. And the final new thing I wanted to mention that the Environment Act will also bring is the opportunity for landowners to enter into a conservation covenant, which I sort of think of as probably rather clumsy shorthand, but it's a voluntary designation. It's you deciding to declare your land for at least a generation and beyond a generation, you know, for a long term, to set aside make a voluntary agreement that obliges current and future lands to manage and protect that land for nature. And that mechanism can go hand in hand with things like offsetting. So if a company or government is investing in land to gain a benefit, they will be increasingly looking to see that benefit will span a long period of time. So I hope that has given you a little bit of food for thought on why nature should be part of your business, and how it can also become part of a business, not just something you might choose to do. Judical. I've done it again. I'm so sorry. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Marion. I think I'm going to start leaving fines payable in chocolate. Thank you very much for this incredibly helpful overview. And what I have taken from that is the multifaceted nature of nature-based solutions, and the fact that they could be used in a variety of ways and for a variety of purposes, and also that they could be used as a risk management tool, which is also interesting. Lots of opportunities for involvement, lots of opportunities for investment, and it was very heartening to see that the projects that have been selected for landscape recovery pilots in the vast majority of cases are involving farmers, including farming clusters, which I think is going to be a really important way of delivering in the future. We're now joined by Joe Evans and Charlie Forbes-Adam, as well as Marion. So please, Marion, do stay on camera, and welcome to the other two. And I've just seen the flashing slide for the Q&A. I think we've seen one question. Please don't be shy. So we are very fortunate to have Joe and Charlie with us today. They're both CLA members of some standing. And thank you for giving us some of your time today. Before I introduce you, again, just an encouragement for participants to put in questions, and thank you if you have already submitted questions in advance. Joe is the managing director of the Whitbourne estate and has been involved with the CLA for some time, and is currently our chair of Environment Committee, which is one of our national committees looking at policy development for the CLA as a whole. And he is weaving, in a way that we'll hear more about in a minute, environmental stewardship schemes in an increasingly diverse business. So welcome, Joe. Charlie has been a very active member of the CLA for a number of years, and as we were discussing earlier, he's actually handed over quite a bit of responsibility to his son. However, he was there at the beginning, and I certainly look forward to hearing more about what it is like to be running a national nature reserve, which at 267 hectares is quite large, and as the site says, comprises one of the largest remaining tracts of lowland heath in the north of England. So again, a very interesting and very diverse business. So gentlemen, thank you very much. Perhaps I could start with a question to Joe and then to Charlie about basically where and how did your conservation journey start? Why get involved at all? So, Joe, do you want to start?
Thank you, Judicael, and good afternoon, everybody. I inherited a number of high-level stewardship schemes from my father when I took over running the estate 10 years ago. So I suppose that's a simple answer as to how I began to understand a little bit about what emerging policy and stewardship schemes look like. I would also say that during my generation, I am the current estate manager at Whitbourne. However, it is not all mine. I very much regard myself as an administrator on behalf of the wider ownership of the family. And my sisters, who are very environmentally and very keen that we look at things beyond the commercial lens, put it that way. I have these annual meetings with the family, and we sat down a couple of years ago and everyone said, right, we want it to be commercially viable, but we also want to deliver real, proper, tangible environmental good with the way in which we manage the estate. And it's easy for them to say, because then I have to go off and try and figure out how to do it. But I think there is a sense that, you know, being lucky enough, as Marion mentioned, being lucky enough to be custodians of a little pocket of Herefordshire comes with a responsibility that means that I do want to try and make decisions that further nature recovery and biodiversity opportunity. So I think, yeah, a journey that's been cumulative rather than one particular moment.
Thank you very much, Joe. Charlie.
Hi, thank you, Judy Kale, and good afternoon, everybody who's attending. I'm very glad to be here. Yeah, getting got two generations, as it were, going on. I'm the one who's at the end, and Joe's relatively new into it. And good luck, Joe, with everything you do. I suppose quite soon after I took over from my father, I developed a mission statement as well as a business plan, and enhancing the environmental side of the estate was very much on a par with the built environment. Also, there was this eternal question of actually making a bit of money, which we mustn't lose sight of. So very soon, as the stewardship schemes came into being, we entered those. We now have 6 stewardship schemes, which is pretty complicated, as well as HLS, a scheme on the National Nature Reserve. But as we've taken in more land, as tenants have retired, I think we've gone for an environmental scheme on every single one. So it has developed, and we'll talk about it a bit more. But I was really delighted that our skip with Common Lowland Heath was elevated from SSSI to National Nature Reserve status, and we have, I think, over the years worked pretty well with Natural England on a local level, which has been great. It's a really positive thing. So, as you mentioned, Judy Kale, my son has now taken over. I'm very much non-executive chairman, trying hard to keep my distance on a day-to-day basis. Actually, it's not been that difficult really so far. But I think it is going to be, the environment is going to be an integral part of the future on the estate, and part of my son's 20, if not to say 30-year plan.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So let's get into the detail of how you do it, how you run conservation projects. And I thought it would be interesting and useful to start off with a question on learning by doing, if you like. So has there been, and I'll start with you, Charlie, one triumph of conservation, something that worked really well, and potentially one disaster, something that absolutely failed, that you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience?
Sure, yes. I mean, I'm not just saying it because of this seminar and Marion's present and Dagmar and everybody else, but certainly our major triumph was the elevation to National Nature Reserve status that I just mentioned. Whenever it was, 25 years ago, the common was in danger because the old traditional grazing management had sort of more or less ended between the wars. It was a danger of just becoming 660 acres of scrub woodland. And quite soon after I arrived, the then local project manager and I got together and worked hard to improve it. There was funding from Natural England, but some of the trees had got so tall that actually was a commercial element. So we felled those, and that was a sort of break-even situation. So we started that sort of clearance project to try and increase the size of Lowland Heath. And I have to say, thanks to all those Natural England people present, that I think, without showing off too much, I think that our elevation coincided a couple of years later with us receiving the Anders Val award from the European Landowners organisation. So it was a real big step forward for us in terms of the environmental side of the estate. The first disaster that came to mind was the RPA inspection last year, but I think that's for another forum, and it's not quite as disastrous as it was at the beginning. But in terms of the National Nature Reserve, 20 years ago, we were trying different sorts of livestock, and we got somebody else's Highland cattle on the scene. Not only did they cause quite a lot of consternation with some of the visitors, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they just completely ignored our electric fencing and even ignored the perimeter barbed wire fencing up to Natural England specification, and just were last spotted heading north, heading back towards the Highlands. So in terms of disasters, it wasn't a huge one, I'm really glad to say. And from that, we moved on to the much more benign longhorns, of which we've got about 18 on the site at the moment, and they're generally much better behaved than our Scottish colleagues.
Thank you very much, and lots of challenges along the way, but it sounds like a major achievement as well. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Judy Kale. Thanks for letting me go second, because my examples are far smaller than what Charlie has just cited. I would say, you know, triumph and disaster are two ends of an extreme. I've probably got a couple of examples that are slightly more inside the spectrum, but in terms of good things that have happened, one very small example, which is when I completed my leisure complex here, and I had this vision of trying to, rather than do manicured clipped lawns and, you know, nice smart gardens, which I'm rapidly learning would have been the easy approach, we decided to build this quite modern architecture to be nestled in amongst wildflower meadow. And when we first made the step to do this, there was this awful kind of muddy shingle, barren, what was sterile bit of builder's waste. And as you're trying to sell high-end weddings to people and leading them down the path in this kind of quagmire, I thought, oh gosh, this is going to work. That was in winter 2019. And this summer we had a wonderful, I think we counted over 250 species of wildflower in this relatively small plot. And I mean, no Natural England support. This was just a little kind of project within the estate. And I thought that was quite a good example of sticking with it and finally getting something beautiful to actually blossom. And then of course the biodiversity that goes with that is a great tick. And it was certainly the right thing to have done. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning, which is both a triumph and ended up being a disaster actually, is that on a more commercial side, whether or not this counts as nature recovery, but we, as part of one of our many countryside stewardship schemes, have a quite ambitious programme of Brookside alder coppice, which we do with our own in-house team. So we coppiced all this alder, we re-fenced it, and fantastic growth back, and a different kind of biodiversity underneath the coppice growth. And then I had about 150 tons of alder, which I successfully chipped. And then Ofgem paid me again to put it through our own biomass system. And I suddenly realized that this whole business of stacking and getting public funds to pay for things twice is just about makes it worthwhile to do and keep the wages going. So I felt that was quite triumphant. But the related disaster point was when I also chipped a huge bonfire full of green brash and then fed that into my biomass boiler and then spent most of the winter unblocking the auger. That was a little less fun, as I'm doing it in my tuxedo, trying to keep the events going at Crumplebury and avoiding running out of hot water. So there's a bit of a spectrum of what it's like to actually be on the kind of working end of an estate approach to programs involving nature recovery and countryside stewardship.
Thank you very much, and thank you for very practical examples of what can go surprisingly right as well as what can go surprisingly wrong. I'm sure we'll get back to that in a minute. We've already got a couple of questions, and they're both for you, Marion. So I'll start with one which I'm sure will be of interest to many members, and it's about how Natural England is planning on supporting projects. And the particular question that we've had in the chat is, how will landowners get help and advice with things like biodiversity net gain? There seems to be no advice plan from Natural England. And the person who's asking the question thinks that the current telephone helpline is not going to cut it. So what's the plan, Marion? You're on mute.
I think two parts to the answer, Jude, or two ways of answering the question, I think. I don't think I would want to pretend that Natural England is ever going to be in a position to offer sort of universal advice to every landowner. That's sort of not what our job is and not what we're resourced to do by government. Where we will be focusing our efforts and giving that sort of farm level advice, if I can call it that, one-to-one advice, it will be where we are focusing on those big landscape recovery schemes under ELMS or on the big nature recovery partnerships. So there will be face-to-face on-site Natural England advice for some parts of the country, for the countries that come forward as priorities for really investing in big nature recovery schemes. One of the changes that happened recently that even though it's been 5 or 6 years ago, hasn't quite yet fully bedded down, is that subtly different relationship or subtly different role that Natural England now plays on agro-environment schemes. So I think the point about the phone call in there, maybe, I think it might actually be the RPA helpline you're thinking of, because Natural England doesn't run a helpline anymore. So if it's queries about government-run schemes, they go through the RPA, and the RPA bring Natural England in when they are able, or when they are needed rather, on again, these sort of higher level schemes and so on are the ones that Natural England gets involved in. I think the other part of the question, Jude, is a really pertinent one in how farmers are going to navigate their way through all of the different funding sources. This idea that you can't necessarily use all the same funding sources for the same piece of land, or certainly not the same outcome. And I think that's the other area we will be focusing on, is on sort of written on online advice on what the rules are about how all of these schemes stack together, and helping, as I mentioned already, landowners in those particular priority areas to identify the best schemes. I said earlier I wasn't going to try and explain all of the details of ELMS, because you will all know there is as much uncertainty surrounding ELMS as certainty at the moment, and it still hasn't yet been defined with government exactly what our role will be in ELMS, but we are expecting it to be a role like that, not necessarily helping people apply and get into individual schemes, but helping landowners navigate the opportunities, navigate the options and so on. So there will be Natural England advice, both written and face-to-face, but we don't, unfortunately, anymore offer a sort of a universal farm advice service. And it might be interesting to hear from others on the call what else is out there, because I think there is a growing market of advisors coming forward. I'm seeing some of the old flags being reinvented and reinvigorated, and also some private businesses looking to give that advice.
You've nicely given me a cue for my next question. I'm sure that the advice on landscape projects and on stacking will be very welcome. And I was going to ask Charlie and then Joe where they get their advice from on a day-to-day basis. So Charlie, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, first thing comes to mind is there's a plethora, I'm sure we're all getting bombarded with them every day, but there's a plethora of emails coming in which can give you the latest information. We're lucky enough to employ a part-time conservation consultant, so it would be part of their role to take advice from others. I think from our point of view, working so well with Natural England generally on the National Nature Reserve, they have been incredibly helpful. So whether anybody listening in has a triple SI or not, I do appreciate that they're pressed for time, but it might be worth a call to your local Natural England project manager, if that's okay, Marion. But you know, so quite often we've asked our local guy some really tricky questions, not just about NNR, but about environmental schemes. And I think he oversees our applications as well. So he's been incredibly helpful. So that really has been a main source for us, I think.
Thank you, Charlie. Joe?
Thank you. I'd say that I'd like more advice, really. I mean, the advice that we have got, I have a very good relationship with our local catchment centre farming officer through Natural England. When he came to do farm visits, helping us with our applications for the latest round of countryside stewardship schemes and working out which bits were GS6 versus GS2 and all that. It was all very good. And I was lucky enough to have quite a decent farm walk with him. And he said, oh, you look, you know, your approach and what you're trying to do, you look like just a sort of place that it would be worth Natural England, you know, doing something a bit more long-term and a bit more kind of out there with you. I was like, yeah, absolutely. But you need to tell me what, and you need to tell me how it stacks up financially. Because I'd love to have more bandwidth, but the bandwidth I have at the moment is basically about navigating the schemes that are already put in front of us, which are sort of well synthesized by organizations like the CLA, obviously, about how to apply for stewardship schemes. But I just don't have the time in my life to be able to do the kind of wider reading that I would so like to do. However, I'd be very receptive if someone said, I've spotted this interesting bit of habitat in the corner of your farm. Are you up for doing these things? And this is what it'll take and how it could work. So I'm not quite sure how you do that. Difficult job for Marion to do that for 80,000 land managers around the country, but that would enable me to do more.
Marion, do you want to come back on any of what you've heard, or?
No, I mean, it's very gratifying to hear that where the Natural England advisors are involved, they're being helpful. So thank you for that feedback. But I think it is just about, I think my advice to people on the call would be to think about all of your options. Yes, there are 80,000 landowners, which we've just heard. There are 3,000 people in Natural England. So we are not going to be able to sort of offer that one-to-one service. But I think we are going to be able to get involved in the cluster farm type experiences, the people who are interested in national nature reserves, and the people interested in the higher tiers of elms.
Okay.
And I just wanted you, forgive me, this is going to sound like a shameless plug, but I think there is a conversation we're having with government at the moment to just keep reinforcing how important the advice is. You will all be hearing this. I think there's a bit of a worry in some parts of government that farmers and landowners should pay for this advice. I think if we want farmers to deliver and landowners to deliver public goods, we need to have a relationship with them, isn't it? It isn't just about advice and it isn't just about a check. It's about a long-term relationship to help that nature recovery develop. And we do have a few more Natural England staff now. We've grown by about 700 staff in the last year, so there will be a little more available.
I think it is really good news, and I think that although the feedback from members tend to be mixed. Some of them like to go to their own advisors that they know and trust, and that would help them anyway in the general running of their farm. Some others are much more likely to want help from Natural England, particularly as the schemes get launched. I think once we know what we're doing, it'll be much easier for the advice market to catch up. And I'm sure there are some excellent advisors out there who are already getting to grips with the new schemes. But it is one of the issues that I think the CLA is also concerned about, launching stuff and expecting people to make sense of them, particularly if they're very new and very different from what they've been doing. A couple of questions on the chat are about nature versus food, and in particular, the balance between protecting the most productive and versatile agricultural land and food production and food security. I think it would be great to hear your view, Marion, and then I'll open it up to both Joe and Charlie in the context of them, how you manage both. So Marion first.
I find it quite difficult at the moment, Judy Cole, that there does seem to be a bit of a conversation, or in some parties, a bit of a conversation about food versus nature. And I kind of hope that isn't where we're going to be heading, because you've heard me say this already, I think we can have both. And I think we have to have both. I think we can't have food security if we don't also have a healthy environment. So I am finding it quite troubling that there is quite a lot of conversation in the media implying we might have to make a choice at some point. Having said that, as the question implies, there are going to have to be choices on individual parcels of land. And I don't think there is any sense from Natural England or from others in DEFRA and others in government that we should be fundamentally undermining that principle of land, which is the best for growing food, is where we grow our food. I think what we are talking about in a lot of the Natural England priorities is looking at, for example, restoring upland peat, looking at where trees could be planted, which are not often on the best and most versatile land. Having said all of that, you will all be aware of the fact that government, on the back of the Henry Dimbleby food strategy, are looking at what a future land use framework might look like. And I think that is the sort of thing where we might need to think about some future-proofed principles. So, how much, not necessarily how much of our land, but what are the sort of principles we can use to make choices on whether our land is principally for food, principally for trees, principally for nature, principally for energy. And I think on most cases, those things can work together across an individual farm, if not across an individual field. But I'd be very interested in hearing thoughts from people on the call. It's not really the sort of call where we can all chip into the chat, but I would certainly be interested in hearing other panelists' views. I suppose the final thought from me, and you could argue that I need a self-selecting subset of farmers and landowners, but quite a lot of people I've visited over the last couple of years are changing their farm businesses to have a lot more space for nature without undermining food production. So I'm seeing people using much more precision farming techniques. So they're growing the same amount of food from a smaller amount of land. And I'm seeing more extensive farming systems that are increasing profitability and food quality. So again, just that sort of sense that it shouldn't be either or. We should be looking at how we can do both.
Thank you, Marion. I think I'll give the floor to Joe first and then bring in Charlie. If you could bear the question in mind as to how you integrate conservation into your general business plan, which might also rely on food production, that would be very helpful. Joe.
Thank you, Judy Kale. I mean, I would defer to the wisdom of Marion about the kind of national picture, and I think every farm, every estate, and the makeup of the type of land they've got would have a slightly different perspective on this. So speaking for myself, we are predominantly permanent pasture here at Whitbourne. My efforts around countryside stewardship, around nature recovery, would be impossible without a successful ruminant animal program running alongside. The way we manage it is I'm in partnership with one of our tenant farmers. So I own no livestock anymore. We had a home farm here for many years, but I maintain management control. And we have this neat system where one of my tenants has grazing rights over the entire estate and grazes an extensive herd of traditional beef and sheep, very low stocking densities. I need all those cow paps, I need all that sheep muck, I need the kind of low browsing to keep the thistles and all the rest of it down. And then I'm able to then spend all of my management time focused on delivering capital projects through stewardship. But I couldn't do that without the animals being there as well. So I think that I entirely agree with whoever was questioning the fact they need to work hand in hand. My version of hand in hand no doubt looks different to another land manager and how they might do it. And it also, I'm under no illusion that my farming practices don't feed the nation. We produce rather expensive traditional breed organic beef that goes into Waitrose and our own fine dining restaurant. So I'm not going to profess to be feeding the nation, but I do think that running commercial livestock production alongside my endeavours in stewardship is absolutely key to it all. And I think, yeah, I regard it as the ethical and environmentally responsible way of growing red meat, which I know has so much kind of hot press at the moment. But yeah, I don't know if that's a useful comment. That's my approach.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
Yeah, it's a big one, and I would certainly back up what both Joe and Marion have said so eloquently. And as our main contractor said a couple of years ago, well, I'll always follow the money, Charlie. And I think we mustn't lose sight of, and particularly at home, we are not losing sight of farming a relatively substantial acreage. The reduction in basic farm payment is going to leave a massive hole in our finances. So whilst we do want to really do our bit for improving the local environment and environmental goods, we need to follow the money. And I think, as Joe said, it's each to their own. For us, we have some, although it's grade 3, it's very productive land now with irrigation growing carrots and turf. I haven't farmed in hand for over 20 years, but we may well leave that to be intensively farmed. I heard somewhere that 60% of our food in this country is grown on 30% of the land, and there is an awful lot of marginal land. So even in the arable flatlands of the Vale of York, we have quite a substantial acreage that was drained when we joined the EU. So I'm long enough in the tooth to remember, my father getting 100% drainage grants and ploughing up what had been permanent pasture for centuries, probably be triple SIs now, and the usual story of ripping up hedges. So I think which I'm no expert to do, but if a lot of farmers actually really drill down, to coin the pun, a lot of their land is not making any money. And if we're going to rely on world prices, which also include world fertilizer prices, we're going to have to look at alternative sources of income, and hopefully they will come from delivering environmental goods. Certainly the awful events of the last few months have brought into sharp relief again food security. And as a country, we haven't really bothered about that much over the last couple of 100 years. But I think it's a case of making the more productive land more productive, getting more out of it, as Marion was saying. I think there is a place for vertical farming, increasing our overall national yield. But I think there's an awful lot of land that actually could do better managed for nature than actually growing combinable crops.
Thank you very much, Charlie and Joe, for your insights. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up this part of the discussion. And thank you for the comments that have been coming in the chat bar. It's really useful to see what is on people's minds and the questions that they're asking themselves. Two takeaways from me from this part of the discussion: follow the money. And also the role of managing land for nature as an alternative source of income. I'm now going to pass the baton to Dagmar Younghans and Louise Hardcastle. So if they wouldn't mind coming on video, and thank you. I see that the slides have reappeared. That'd be great. Dagmar and Louise are going to give us a short introduction to one particular mechanism for nature recovery, namely national nature reserves. So Dagmar is the Natural England Principal Advisor on national nature reserves and leading on this around across England, and has been working previously in Natural England in a range of roles. And Louise is an agricultural valuer and surveyor by background and has experience in private practice, but also working in DEFRA and now in Natural England. So if you want to go to the next slide, please, Caroline. Dagmar, over to you.
Thank you very much, Judical. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you to national nature reserves. I'm sure some of you are already involved with them or interested in them. And again, I'll just point to the event that we're going to be holding in Elmley, which is going in October, which is going to be specifically focusing on national nature reserves. I'm going to start with an excuse me, which is I'm probably going to use the abbreviation NNR sometimes because it gives me a little more time for wordage. But what I will do is start with actually what are national nature reserves. We describe them as the finest places in England for wildlife. But what are they? So it is a type of designation, but it's a voluntary designation. I'll come on my next slide to how different bodies own and manage and hold and manage NNRs, but they're all part of the NNR family that was created by the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. And as such, they're part of the same family as national parks and national trails, but they're NNR's national nature reserves are much less well known than national parks and national trails. Part of my job is trying to change that, and we'll have it. You'll see in the chat that there is a festival of national nature reserves this year to celebrate the 70th anniversary that Marion mentioned, and that festival includes a calendar of events at NNRs across the country. So do have a look at the link in the chat and see if there's anything going on near you. It runs to the end of October. So they are national. I mean, the word national says it all. They're nationally important sites. Many of them, but not all, are sites of special scientific interest. The slide gives you the basic bones of the core purposes. What I'd like to add is that the primary land use, one of the things that distinguishes them from SSSIs, for example, is that the primary land use is nature conservation. The interpretation of that has broadened out since we started with them in the 1950s. And now we have a real intent and focus to include restoration and even creation of new habitats. And we've been doing this for a while, but with the advent of the Nature Recovery Network, which we're talking about today, it's really important that NNRs play a big part in this. And one way to do that is to include new land which hasn't previously been designated for anything in our national nature reserves, to do really forward-thinking conservation work on. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing I'd like to touch on is the rather archaic phrase of geological monuments. Today we would call that geology or geodiversity. Only a few national nature reserves are specifically declared for geology, but it's important to all of them. I mean, it's important to all our land and all our land use and our land management. But we're going to be doing more in future to highlight the importance of geology in NNRs. And it's often the thing that directly links the cultural heritage of a site to its use today. Another really important aspect that I want to highlight are that all national nature reserves are voluntary, and so all partners involved, they're there because they want to be part of what's going on. So it is a designation, but it's a voluntary. NNRs are declared, and that declaration is of, it's because the people involved want to be there. So could I have the next? Sorry, before the next slide. Before the next slide, I have just listed on the previous slide the 6 NNRs that were first declared, because this year is the 70th anniversary, and I'm sure some of you listening are near to Teesdale, Devon, Holmfell in Huntingdon, Cavenham Heath in Suffolk, Ham Street Wood in Kent, well, Kingley Vale in Sussex. And these sites are, these are the pioneer sites where we really learnt as an organisation what it took to set them up. And they are now really, vibrant. They're bearing their 70 years very well, and they're some of our best NNRs. So next slide, please. So this map shows us how the spread of national nature reserves across England, and it also shows the range of ownership. In the early days, in their original form, they were only managed by Natural England's predecessor bodies. Some of you may remember the Nature Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy Council, which is the one that I joined, although that's slightly embarrassingly long ago. But since the 1980s, we've been able to approve other bodies to hold and manage national nature reserves. And again, you'll see on the slide that includes charities, public sector bodies, and importantly for today, private landowners. There are 62 approved bodies, soon to be 65. We've got 2 new NNR declarations coming up in the next couple of months, and they will bring new bodies with them. Some of the approved bodies, as Marion said, are private landowners, and Elmley Conservation Trust and Holcombe Estate, we've already mentioned. There's also the Clinton Devon Estate on the Pebblebed Heaths in Devon, and they're by far the major landowner there, and do an absolutely great job. Across England, there's 219 national nature reserves. Natural England we hold and manage about 113 of those ourselves. Approved bodies are rapidly catching up with 84, and together we have joint sites on 22, and I've color coded those, so if you squint at the map closely you'll be able to see the spread. And another important thing to mention about partners is that we have a national steering group for NNRs, and we have a range of partners on that, including Jake Fines from Holcombe, and until very recently, Charlie, I'm sure this should have been the major point on his biography, but he's been a really valuable member of that NNR steering group, and he's given us incredibly helpful insights from the landowner's point of view as to what it feels like and the practical aspects of managing an NNR. So next slide, please. Right, so looking forward, we've mentioned 70-year anniversary, but looking forward, what are NNRs going to be doing over the next 70 years? I'm focusing, there's lots of aspects to this, but I'm going to focus here on nature recovery and landowner involvement, thinking back to thinking back to Marian's introduction about how nature conservation is changing as we move through this century. It seems obvious to say that NNRs are at the heart of the nature recovery network, but you know, I'm restating it because it's so important. You know, they are some of the best biodiversity hotspots, and they're places where they're little wildlife reservoirs, and hopefully as land, you know, we build the nature recovery network, and landowners and other bodies are more and more involved in that network. The NNRs will be the places that start to repopulate the surrounding land where space is made. And NNRs are already part of some of the new landscape recovery schemes. For example, the one in Somerset, the Somerset Wetlands NNR is a key part of that, and also the North Norfolk coast, you know, radiating out from Holcombe Estate. So both of those have NNRs at the heart, and we'll be working closely with that scheme to see how the mechanism of NNR can really help galvanise things.
I'm really sorry, Dagmar, would you mind speeding up, please?
Yes, of course. I'm on my last bit, and I mean, the slide really says it all. We've got one really important thing relating to landowners is the exciting potential for new landowner partners in terms of restoration and creation being part of the NNR network. And the last thing, the slide says the key things. The last thing I want to pick up on is that we're looking to develop a broader range of approved bodies. And Marian mentioned conservation covenants, and that hopefully will give us more flexibility about how we can include new partners or landowners as approved bodies, because that will give us the longevity that's needed. So if you flick on to the next slide, please, and I can hand over to Louise.
Thanks, Dagmar, and good afternoon, everybody. Following on from Dagmar, I'll just give a little explanation about the Natural England National Nature Reserve estate. When I mention Natural England, people tend to think of the statutory roles that we undertake or agri-environment schemes. And what seems to be less well known is that Natural England are also landowners and land managers. So the estate comprises of over 60,000 hectares. And how this is actually managed depends on the tenure of that land. So there's about 18,000 hectares of freehold and 26,000 hectares that we lease under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. And for this freehold and leasehold, Natural England are fully responsible for the management and funding of the reserve. The final section of the estate is land managed through nature reserve agreements. And under these, the landowners retain the occupational control of the land, but the land has to be managed within parameters prescribed within the agreement. And that agreement sets out the rights and responsibilities of both parties and tends to encourage collaborative working between Natural England and the landowner, both in terms of the management and the sourcing of funding. Next slide, please. So to summarise the key ways that landowners can get involved with national nature reserves where their land meets the relevant selection criteria, they can seek approved body status, and by doing so they would be fully in control of the management of the land as a reserve. They may wish to lease NNR land to an approved body or Natural England, or they may look for a nature reserve agreement with Natural England and work together. There's also an opportunity where a landowner holds land which may not fit the NNR selection criteria, but neighbours an existing reserve. There may be further opportunities with the natural capital markets with areas such as biodiversity net gain, where habitat plans would not only benefit the landowner's land, but further enhance the nationally recognised reserve. And I'll just sort of finish now with a couple of the main opportunities where an NNR declaration is in place. So first of all, there is enhancement of the land's natural capital. For example, reserve management may increase carbon sequestration. You then have visitor management and experience. And what we tend to find is that where we have reserve wardens and volunteers on the ground, there is the increased ability to manage visitor behaviour, but also increase the quality of the experience of the visitor. And I think the third and sort of the final obvious opportunity is commercial enterprise. So where you have local businesses in the area, with the easy example perhaps of a cafe, they can benefit from the increased footfall that the area receives when people are visiting that reserve. So each site, each piece of land is unique and will have different pros and cons of working either as or with a national nature reserve, but hopefully that's given a flavour and a little bit of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dagmar and Louise, for this concise but nevertheless very informative presentation. Unfortunately, we're going to have to skip the questions because we're now over time. But this brings us to not just the end of today, but also a shameless plug for another event which has already been mentioned, which is on the 5th of October on the Emley National Nature Reserve. It is a visit that would enable people who want to know more about going down the National Nature Reserve route. It's a whole day event which is kindly hosted by Emley Nature Reserve in Kent as part of Natural England's Nature Reserve Festival. If you'd like to attend, please look at the events page of the CLA website, and because you'll be able to register there. And that's not the end of the opportunity to get more information. We'll be holding a webinar on collaborating for environmental markets in the second half of October. So watch this space. Again, it will be listed on the CLA website. And there will be more events in our Natural Capital series later on. The slides that you've got in front of you, although also list 3 guidance notes that are available to CLA members, one on biodiversity net gain, one on transition, agricultural transition and the various schemes that are available, and the final one on natural capital, public goods and environmental markets. If you've got any questions arising from this session and you're a CLA member, please do not hesitate to contact either the advice team at the email address given on the slide, or indeed your regional office. So I'm really sorry that we didn't have time for more, and I hope that you have found this event interesting nevertheless. Thank you very much again to all our panelists for their time, and thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye.